Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer a very interesting question. Why are studio recordings, at least of orchestral works, generally superior to live recordings of same orchestral works? Why is that? Well, there's a long and complicated story, which we're going to talk about in some detail, because I think it's really an important thing to realize. I've seen sometimes in the comments section that people say, well, when you make lists of who the great conductors of such and such are, you don't talk about any recent ones or who the great modern artists are who are fabulous. And there are fabulous modern artists. There really are. I see a wider gap, actually, between how people are perceived as live musicians in concert and whether or not the recordings that they make accurately represent the extraordinary claims made for them from people who go to the concerts. Now, the fact of the matter is, I don't trust the word of anybody who goes to see a concert that I haven't seen, unless I really know who they are and know that I can count on their word, because all concerts are fun, and you usually have a great time. That doesn't mean that they're going to make great records. It really, really doesn't. But there is something going on, and here is what I think is going on. Back in the beginning, at the dawn of time, like in the 1950s and 60s, let's start with the beginning of the stereo era, shall we? So we're talking about the mid-50s. Making a record was a big deal. That's the first thing that mattered. It wasn't just a question of set up the microphones on a typical evening at your subscription symphony concert and record whatever happens and release it. It was special. It was special simply because it required a special effort. You had a large company making an investment in the recording. They had to pay the musicians. They had a limited amount of time to get it done. They had producers who were themselves extraordinarily musical people, smart people who knew what great music making sounded like. You had artists who knew that they would not always have the opportunity to record everything that they did at the drop of a hat, that making a record was a monument, something for future preservation, something that had to maintain a certain level of quality. The label that they worked for had a certain quality image. They had a reputation to uphold. All of those things were in the backs of people's minds when they were making recordings. So the act of making the recording was special. Then there's the question of what happened when they actually made the recording. They had the time, normally. I mean, it was a limited amount of time, but they had the time to redo mistakes, to correct errors, to stop and listen to something back in the control room and then go out and do it again if they didn't think it was right, to try and make it better, to improve as they went. All of those things, which they don't really have today anymore. All of those things led to a greater perfection of the product. Perfection in all ways, interpretively, emotionally, expressively, technically, the whole deal, sonically, all of that. All of that could be addressed under controlled conditions. Now, it is absolutely true that some artists were less happy with the recording process than others. Some were more comfortable making records than others were. So there were always those artists who disliked the process or who froze in the studio and delivered performances that were far less spontaneous or exciting than one might hear live. And the live recordings that they left us sometimes bear that out. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. But it is a mistake. It is absolutely wrong. I mean, it's becoming increasingly clear how wrong it is to assume that the live circumstance is inherently better. Actually, that's not true. And we're seeing or hearing that it's not true. And the reason that it's not true is because today what happens, as often as not, is that most recordings of orchestral repertoire are made live. They're made from live concerts of some kind. There may be more than one concert. They may be edited together. There may be a couple of patching sessions. You never know. But the fact of the matter is that the circumstances that allow for the creation of optimal results are far more limited than they were in decades past. Money is scarce. Recordings need to be subsidized. Labels have very little say in what actually is getting recorded. They are, at least the major labels now, merely distribution networks through which recordings are funneled after the decision to make them has already been taken and the finished product is simply delivered. And they just issue the stuff and they don't care. That's a big difference. A very, very big difference. The other issue that this sort of raises is the question of what is a label and what is a catalog. Because back in the day when you had a few big labels and small independent labels run by really crazy but devoted individual producers, they had a vision. They had a vision for the label. They were able to find the artists who fit that vision, and they only made records that fit into their catalog. Think about it. Klaus Mekela just recorded Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique for Decca. Decca is part of Polygram. How many recordings of the Symphonie Fantastique does Polygram have? I mean, dozens. I mean, the answer is, or Warner, or any of the larger labels, they have a zillion recordings of this thing. Who decided they needed another one? What angle, what element, what niche in the repertoire, what part of the catalog does Decca need to fill? Would it be best that Decca fill? Would they be talking to their artists about filling? All he's done is things that everyone else has done a million times. And it would be one thing if, even if it's been done a million times, if he had a focus on a particular niche of the repertoire. And Decca said, okay, we're going to do this. Or look at Andres Nelson's. Well, he just did the Mendelssohn symphonies, right? I think he did. He already did Beethoven. He already did Bruckner. He already did Shostakovich. They're just working their way down through the repertoire, but with no feasible guiding intelligence deciding whether or not they have any feel for that music or not. I remember reading vividly in the by the Klemperer biography, one of the Klemperer biographies, I think it was Peter Hayward's, but there were some notes from Walter Legg to EMI about Klemperer doing Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. Now, Warner had plenty of recordings of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, but Klemperer did it, and Walter Legg wrote, Klemperer just raised the roof with Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, so we're going to take it in the studio and record it because it was amazing. And they did it, and the recording was amazing. They knew what they were going to get. And that was a one-off, and it sold, and it was amazing, and so they did 4 and 6, which weren't as good, by the way. But the impetus came from either a stunning live performance that the artists in question were willing to take into the studio and deliver in the studio, the same level of quality, or a repertoire niche that needed to be filled, as when Decca decided to do all the Janacek stuff with Charles Mackerras. Charles Mackerras was not the best-known conductor in the universe, and Janacek was certainly not a known quantity, but it was a niche that they could fill and that they could own. The same thing with Antal Doradi's Haydn Symphony Cycle. And they made money on it because they filled a niche. And although they haven't kept it in print continuously the way they should have, whenever it comes back, it does well again because it's great. They made great records. The people who were involved filled the niche and did it with an eye to the future. Nowadays, you don't see that at all. What we have are orchestras that are extremely talented technically. They can play anything, and they can play anything almost note perfect. But what we're recording, however technically good the orchestras are, what they're recording, the product is simply your average subscription concert. There's no ability to determine whether it's any good in advance because you've seen it or you've heard it and it was dazzling, or if you saw it and heard it and it was dazzling and they decide to record it live and it isn't dazzling, who's going to say, wait a minute? What producer is going to say, I heard this and it was dazzling. This just isn't. So it's not good enough. We're not going to release it. There's no one to do that. It's just not happening. If you have orchestras doing their own recordings and you have the inmates running the asylum, which is always a bad idea, they're stuck with whatever happens on the night, their average subscription night. But that's what we're witnessing now. Recordings are no longer special. The circumstances to create recordings, to make them special, no longer exist. And as a result, you're getting what you would see on a night when you had your tickets and you went to the symphony, and probably it was good. Probably it was nice. You may have had a wonderful time if you were there, but it just didn't deserve to be preserved and issued as a permanent document of an artist's conception of the work in question. I mean, that's where we are today. Does that mean that there aren't any great performances? Of course there are. There will be. There are also wonderful conductors and wonderful artists, and there may be subscription night performances that are stunning, and some of them may be captured and released on recordings. But the chances of that happening are slim. And so we're going to be awash in just a tide of okay stuff. But with all that said, I think it's a mistake to say that because the circumstances are different, because that's the way things are, classical music is dying and everything's going to hell. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that our ability to document greatness has diminished. I really believe that. It's not that it isn't there. It's just we're not going to hear it as frequently because artists aren't given the opportunity to be at their best, and the industry itself is no longer aligned in such a way so as to capture them at their best. All that means is that, of course, criticism is like enormously necessary and vital and significant. But I also want to make it clear, when I see in the comments things like, well, I'm 60 some odd years old and all I like is old stuff and things, we don't talk about what's new. Well, the truth of the matter is, there was a time when things were better, when the win percentage was higher than it is today. And I firmly believe that great music making is happening all the time, but it's going to be harder to find, much harder to find, harder to build a consensus around, because I know from reading the comments, especially from younger people and people who are less experienced, that they will listen to the latest version of something and say it's wonderful and it's probably pretty good. But unless you have the history, the discography in your head, unless you've had the opportunity to hear decades and decades of performances of these same things, it's going to be very difficult to judge whether today's okay subscription average version is really as good as you might think it is. And then there's the question of whether or not it matters at all. And I'm not saying that cynically. I mean that seriously. If people are happy and the performance delivers the emotional goods and they're expressively and they feel like they made a good investment, more power to them. I think it's useful for people who want to know how far you can go in terms of excellence and expressivity and interpretive genius to know what the best versions really are. And I always hope that something wonderful is going to come along that's brand new, that I'm not living entirely in the past. But the fact is, we have a fabulous past. There was a time when the setup was right to achieving the best results. I mean, Fritz Reiner's Ein Heldenleben didn't happen by circumstance. That was not your average subscription performance. That was a performance where everybody was geared up to do their absolute best work. The technology was new. The setup was new. The producers were excited. Reiner had something to prove. The orchestra was on the top of its form. He terrorized them into it. And the result was a classic that still is one of the great recordings ever made, both interpretively and sonically and technically and any way you want to think about it. And the evidence, and that's not an opinion. I mean, it's evidentiary fact. You could compare that with a score if you want, the sound of it, to anything that came afterwards, certainly anything that happened today, and know exactly where we are. And so I say this because I want people, especially younger people, to understand that in addition to the amazing history of classical works, the repertoire, this astonishing body of musical genius that we have to enjoy, it's enormous, there is also the history of recordings of those works. And that history includes periods when the circumstances were optimal for everyone to do their best. And right now, the circumstances are not optimal. I'm telling you right now, they're not optimal. Doesn't mean, like I said, that things won't be good once in a while, now and again, but they aren't optimal. So that's my opinion of it, and that's why I'm telling you that the recordings of the 50s, 60s, 70s, quite a few of them that were studio productions, carefully made, are on average going to be superior than the workaday subscription night random results that were often being offered today under the guise of superlative work, because the audible evidence speaks for itself. So keep on listening, friends, and let's find the greatness under the piles of mediocrity. It's there. We're just going to have to dig a little harder. Take care.